a picture emerged that Homeland Security never mentioned in its statements. A picture that many believe explains exactly why Renee Nicole Good never made it out of her car alive. And what followed next is where the story stopped being about a single shooting and started becoming something far more disturbing. Jonathan Ross wasn't just an ICE agent with experience. He wasn't just a member of a special response team trained for high-risk encounters. He was also, according to multiple law enforcement databases and court-linked records, a man with unresolved domestic violence allegations tied to him, allegations that never resulted in termination, suspension, or public discipline. And that matters because those allegations weren't buried in some distant past. They were active, they were recent, and they were serious enough that Ross was reportedly wanted for questioning in connection with a domestic violence complaint at the time of the Minneapolis incident. That revelation alone raises a question that Homeland Security has yet to answer. Why was a man with unresolved domestic violence issues still deployed on a high-intensity street operation involving civilians? According to former DHS insiders who spoke anonymously, ICE enforcement teams are supposed to undergo continuous psychological evaluation, especially agents assigned to elite tactical units. Any agent involved in repeated use of force incidents is meant to be flagged for review. Jonathan Ross had already been involved in a near-fatal use of force encounter less than a year earlier. And yet he was back on the streets. On January 7, 2026, South Minneapolis was already tense. ICE vehicles had been moving through residential streets throughout the day, drawing attention from locals who were aware of ongoing immigration enforcement activity. Multiple witnesses later said agents appeared agitated, rushed, and aggressive, behavior that escalated as crowds began to gather. Renee Nicole Good was not part of any organized protest. She wasn't carrying signs. She wasn't chanting. She wasn't interfering physically with an arrest. She was driving. Witnesses say she had pulled her SUV into the street after seeing ICE vehicles struggling in the snow. Her actions, according to multiple videos, were minimal, stopping briefly, signaling for agents to go around and attempting to reposition her vehicle. At no point does footage show Renee accelerating toward an agent. At no point does footage show her steering directly into anyone's path. At no point does footage show a crowd using her vehicle as cover. Instead, what the footage shows is confusion, agents approaching her vehicle from multiple sides, shouting commands simultaneously, pulling at her door handle, and positioning themselves dangerously close to a moving car. That proximity is critical, because law enforcement training manuals are explicit about one thing. Officers should never place themselves in front of or alongside a moving vehicle unless deadly force is already justified. And yet that is exactly what happened. Jonathan Ross moved into the vehicle's path. When Renee's SUV began to roll forward, not lunge, not accelerate, Ross fired. 3 shots. 3 decisions. 3 irreversible outcomes. What happened immediately after the shooting is just as troubling as the shooting itself. As Renee's vehicle rolled forward and collided with a parked car, witnesses can be heard screaming for help. One man, identified later as a licensed medical professional, ran toward the vehicle. He was stopped. Video shows ICE agents physically blocking him from reaching Renee. Minutes passed. Minutes that could have mattered. Renee was still alive. She was bleeding but conscious. Witnesses say she was moving. She was breathing. And yet aid was delayed. Federal agents later claimed the scene was not secure. But critics argue that explanation doesn't hold up. There was no active threat, no gunfire, no hostile crowd, no weapons visible. Just a woman bleeding inside her car. By the time paramedics were finally allowed to intervene, Renee Nicole Good had lost too much blood. She was pronounced dead shortly after. She was 37 years old. She was a US citizen. She was a mother of 3. Within hours, the official narrative was already set. Homeland Security labeled Renee as a domestic terrorist. A woman who allegedly weaponized her vehicle. A woman who supposedly stalked agents all day. Those claims spread rapidly. They were repeated by federal officials. They were amplified by partisan media. They were used to justify lethal force. But then the videos spread. And the videos told a different story. Independent analysts slowed the footage frame by frame. They tracked tire angles, vehicle movement, agent positioning. Their conclusion was nearly unanimous. Renee did not pose an imminent threat. Her tires were turned away. Her speed was minimal. Her path was clear. She was leaving. Even more damaging to the federal narrative was a second video that surfaced hours later, one showing Renee calmly telling agents to go around her vehicle before she attempted to move. That video contradicted nearly every claim in Homeland Security's statement. And once that contradiction became public, the backlash intensified. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz broke ranks with federal authorities in an unprecedented move. He openly rejected the Homeland Security account. He demanded ICE leave Minneapolis. And he issued a warning order for the Minnesota National Guard, not to support federal agents but to protect the community. That alone sent a powerful message. This was no longer being treated as a justified shooting by local leadership. It was being treated as a federal overreach with fatal consequences. Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey went even further. In a blunt public statement, he told ICE to get out of the city entirely. Not temporarily. Not after an investigation. Immediately. His reasoning was simple. ICE claimed they were in Minneapolis to increase safety. But a mother was dead. Protests erupted that same night. Crowds gathered. Chants echoed. Signs reading "Justice for Renee" filled the streets. Online, the outrage was even louder. The name Jonathan Ross began trending. And that's when his past resurfaced. Ross had been praised internally for his expert marksmanship. He had been rewarded for aggression. He had been protected after prior incidents. The June 2025 case involving Roberto Carlos Munoz, Guatemala, should have been a turning point. Ross smashed a car window, reached inside a vehicle, deployed a taser, and ended up dragged nearly 100 yards when the driver fled. That was not a controlled encounter. That was a failure of protocol. Yet DHS framed it as heroism. No psychological re-evaluation. No reassignment. No suspension. Instead, Ross remained on active duty. Critics argue that incident alone should have disqualified him from street enforcement, especially when combined with unresolved domestic violence allegations, especially when combined with repeated high-risk confrontations, especially when combined with a pattern of escalating force. DHS policy explicitly forbids firing at a moving vehicle unless deadly force is already justified. It also warns officers not to place themselves in the path of a vehicle. Jonathan Ross violated both. And according to multiple reports, he knew it. That may explain what happened next. Because within minutes of Renee Good's final moments, Jonathan Ross left the scene. Not to secure evidence. Not to provide a statement. He drove away. Federal officials initially claimed the officer involved was hospitalized. That claim collapsed under scrutiny. Ross was not hospitalized. He was not detained. He was not questioned on site. He vanished. And that disappearance has only fueled suspicions. Was he fleeing accountability? Was he being protected? Or was this standard protocol quietly shielding an agent from immediate consequences? Homeland Security has refused to answer. As of now, Jonathan Ross has not been arrested. He has not been publicly charged. He has not faced disciplinary action. The investigation, officials say, is ongoing. For Renee's family, that word means nothing. They buried a mother. They buried a daughter. They buried a woman whose final moments were caught on camera. Moments the federal government insists are being misunderstood. This case is no longer just about use of force. It's about credibility. It's about whether federal agencies can be trusted to police themselves. It's about whether certain officers are allowed to accumulate red flags without consequence until someone dies. And it's about whether accountability applies equally, even when the badge says ICE. Because if video evidence can be ignored, if policy violations can be explained away, if violent patterns can be protected, then Renee Nicole Good was never just a tragic mistake. She was the outcome of a system that failed long before January 7th. And the question that remains is not whether Jonathan Ross pulled the trigger. We know that. The question is whether anyone above him will finally answer for letting him be there in the first place. And whether this case will fade into another statistic, or force a reckoning that can no longer be avoided.